And Lynn, I'll leave it to you to do our introduction.
I will introduce Dr. MacManus in a second. I do want to say that this presentation and Q&A will have to be confined to 1 hour because Dr. MacManus has another obligation and needs to definitely leave at 2:30. Dr. MacManus is a distinguished university professor emerita in the Department of Government and International Affairs School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies, University of South Florida. She recently co-authored Florida's Minority Trailblazers, the men and women who changed the face of Florida government, and has also co-authored other books. Dr. MacManus was past director of the annual USF Nielsen Sunshine State Survey, the state's most extensive annual public policy survey of adult Floridians. She has been the political analyst for Tampa's ABC affiliate since 2016 and is Florida's chief political news analyst. She served as chair of the Florida Elections Commission from 1999 to 2003 and helped the Collins Center for Public Policy, Inc. draft Florida's Help America Vote Act state plan. Dr. MacManus received the first biennial Diane Blair Award for Outstanding Achievement in Politics and Government from the Southern Political Science Association in 2001, the Walter Cronkite Award for Excellence in Television Political Journalism from the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Southern California in 2005, and in 2014, the SPSA Manning Dower Award for Exceptional Service to the Profession. And we're very honored that you could make the time, and I'll turn it over to you, Susan.
Well, it's really a pleasure to talk to all of you. I know you're very interested in politics, and by the way, what a shocker the other night. I mean, there's just, things are always changing, and that's sort of the theme of the presentation that I'm going to give, is that so many people look at from outside into Florida and they only look at one half of our electorate's equation. And the generational things that I'm going to talk about that are referring to Florida are patterns that we're seeing across the country. It's just that Florida is always ahead of the game, so to speak, in anything related to generations because we are so very age diverse. So let's just get started here with reflecting on the patterns that we've seen in the past in this state. And if you look at these 5 elections, 3 governors and 2 presidents prior to last year's election, it was a 1% state, which is how we got the reputation of being the biggest swing state and most important swing state in the country. Well, along comes 2020, and we saw for the first time in forever that the saying, as Florida goes, so goes the nation, did not turn out to be the case. And the margin of victory was huge by Florida standards, 3.4%. Trump carried the state. So what this has led a lot of people to be looking at and focusing on generations is this question right now, which I'm sure that is very familiar to each of you, a big question nationally and within the parties actually here. Has Florida lost its swing state status as a consequence of that 3.4% margin last time out? So a lot of Republicans and even some of the media now is starting to say, well, Florida's not the swing state it used to be because of that margin and because Republicans made gains in congressional and state legislative seats in the 2020 cycle. But Florida Democrats are saying, no, it's still a very, very competitive state. It was just that we ran a really bad campaign in 2020. And if you need some verification of these kinds of critiques of the 2020 election from the perspective of Democrats, simply go to the post-election analysis done by the party, and you will see all of these things referred to that they attribute that big loss to in 2020. So the real question, looking ahead to 2022, which is the theme of your series, is what is it going to be? Is Florida going to prove that 2020 was an anomaly, or is it going to prove that no, we're no longer the swing state that we used to be? As you know, the stakes in this state are very, very high. And one of the things that's really difficult about even looking back last year and looking ahead to next year is how fast our population changes. And it's really kind of important that you look, just even if you can't read it very well, my eyesight's not great either, but that top graphic shows you the dark line that's the heaviest up and down, and compared to the purple line at the bottom. That is population change that has occurred because of net migration into our state. And the sort of natural migration has sort of been steadier, but it's the people moving in and out that has really changed the state. It's tampering down a little bit, but I'm going to show you some stats a little bit later. In the midst of the pandemic, Florida had an onslaught of people moving down here. And of course, one of our big questions is, how are they going to vote in the elections next year? We were one of 2 states or 3 states to pick up seats. We got 1. Texas is the only one that got bigger. But the people moving in here, and this is very important, in the last part of the decade and post actually pandemic, were not migrants coming in from the Latin and South America, the typical pattern that we see. It's been more from coming in from other states, as we'll look at later. So all of this makes us as analysts very attentive to some things that growth causes us to look at. And we see very vivid patterns in Florida of changes in the voter makeup of not only the voters, but the candidates themselves, and definitely a more racially and ethnically diverse population, which is tied to the next one, age shifts, and also tied to generational schisms that are deepening. And even where people are moving is changing a lot of what we're looking at politically. It's no longer the case that the real growth is in the heavily urban areas now that everybody can work online and don't have to go into the office as much. We're seeing some changes and so forth. But I think this is the trend that says it all. Many of you are probably aware of it. The bottom line is that there's very little difference in the percentage of our registrants who are Democrats and Republicans. Last count, it was less than 24,000, with Democrats slightly ahead. The story here, and this is very generationally driven, is that line at the bottom. The NPAs are the sharpest growing group. This is a pattern you see across the country, but it's very sharp in Florida. As I mentioned, our population is growing diverse. You may not have recognized how fast this is happening, and the fact that it's occurred across a lot of groups. The only racial group that's lost share of our population is the Anglo part or white part. But multiracial and Asian and Black populations are going up slightly. It's the Hispanic population that has boomed over the past decade. But by any stretch, what you're going to see is a pattern that's reflected in Florida. If you see orange, that means that that county has a larger Black population than is true of the nation at large. And if you see purple, it means that that county has a larger Black and Hispanic, larger share than the country. So you see from the midriff of Florida down, from Central Florida down, you see virtually every county has a more diverse population than is true across the country. But here's a danger, and I warn you about polls that only look at pie charts that stop at broad categories. We have the most diverse Hispanic population of any state. The Southwest has largely Mexican Americans, but we have people coming in from virtually every country in Latin America. And it's really dangerous to assume that all these groups vote alike. And unfortunately, if you're a Democrat, that was what a lot of the national pollsters that were guiding Florida's campaign for Biden made the mistake of not realizing the nuances and the power that country of origin, even if you're a second or third generation, the ties to one of your countries there going back in your family really does change things. And this was what happened in 2020. the Republicans were able to put together a strong and high turnout coalition of Cubans, Cubans, Colombians, Venezuelans, Dominicans, Hondurans, Nicaraguans over the issue of socialism. And what we saw in some of the results yesterday and who won in their various places, the problem of socialism amongst particularly the Latino or Latinx groups continues, and it's really vivid in Florida. And you see the power of origin when it comes to that issue of socialism, because normally younger Latinos tend to be more focused on domestic policy as opposed to older ones who are more focused on foreign policy. But the intergenerational connections between younger Latinos and their grandparents and so forth in our state, where we've had a lot of people coming from these countries, over that issue, it melded back the generations together. So we are still wondering about that looking ahead. We also have the most diverse Black population in the United States. And if you had a chance to look at any of the headlines down in Southeast Florida yesterday, you saw some really important victories by Caribbean Blacks in some of the South Florida local offices, and high levels of victory there. And it is the case that often the two Caribbean Black populations don't always agree 100% with American-born Blacks in their politics. They tend to be a little bit more independent, but also a bit guided by the socialism kind of issue. We also have a lot of diversity among Florida Asians. And for those of you who are activists, this is one of the most interesting things about 2020 is that Asians who are interviewed in post-election analyses acknowledge that they really, no one appealed for their votes. And yet in areas like yours, well, actually, a lot of Asian populations are larger around academic institutions and military installations and so forth for technological skills and educational acumen. So the Indian portion of Florida, the Asians heavily voted for Biden. In contrast, the most Republican one was Vietnamese. Again, you see the power of that whole socialism issue and closeness and proximity to that issue. So what I'm going to show you is there's a powerful link between what I'm telling you here that's generic to Florida and how that interfaces with our generational makeup in our state. But I think this is a fascinating projection, and that is that Florida will be majority, whites will be in the minority. It will be a majority minority state by 2020, which is actually 5 years ahead of where the projections are for the US at large. Again, we're on the cusp. We're sort of the leading indicator of a lot of these demographic trends that other states come to realize a bit later than us. But this is the graphic that really tells the story about the message today. And that is, if you look at this is voter generation data from the voter registration file going back to 2015 through 2021. And what you'll notice is that in a relatively short amount of time, the three youngest generations have gone from 48% of our actual registrants to 57% today. And what you're seeing increasingly is a tendency to lump the silent and greatest generations with boomers in some analysis. I don't like to do it because I still think there's differences, but you will see some pollsters lump the older as one group, but pay a lot more attention to the nuances of what's happening in these younger generations who have now become a majority share of Florida's registered voters. And again, most people have no idea about how fast this is happening. And that Generation Z is projected to be the same size as the millennials in a shorter amount of time than it took millennials to get to that point. But there is one thing I will point out to you about this youngest generation. We've now noticed in the last couple of years that women are delaying having children, and the fertility rate in Florida is dropping among this younger demographic, which may change the speed at which these groups really overtake boomers in some of the power positions in our state. But why look at generations? I think this graphic, I'll give you a minute to study it, really tells the tale. It's much more meaningful than simple chronology, age chronology. Why? Because it tells you the formative issues and events that happened during that particular generation's political maturation, meaning from the time the first group hit 18 to the time the last group hit it. And you see some tremendous differences. I'm obviously a boomer, and the things and the diversity of presidents, the issues that frame some of our thinking are just very different than those that are affecting the outlook and the context in which Generation Z, which is the 23-year-olds and younger, this year it would be 24 and younger, that generation. But just look at the number of crises that they've gone through, and I had to add climate change is now a huge one. Just since some of the other ones, it's become a big issue. And if you also look at the presidents, the two younger generations are a little turned off of the two major parties. And when you look at the presidents, and for a lot of these people, they're still thinking politics, it means national politics. And they look and they didn't see any difference in their lives and what happened between a Democrat or Republican administration. They just haven't seen it. So they have a different context. This is the point looking ahead to 2022. I cannot use the same message or the same means of communication to get across to people from these generations in the same way that I used to be able to do with confidence. I can't use television to reach them, for example. It just doesn't work. The messaging has to be different. I spoke to Leadership Florida group in Tallahassee yesterday, the young group, 25 to 40. And I was telling them about this, and I said, you should not, if you want to reach this younger demographic, rely upon people who are outside of this demographic very far, because that's where a lot of campaigns make a mistake, and they wonder when all is said and done, well, I can't turn out this younger demographic, and yet they're a big part of my base. Messaging and means of communication have to be extremely micro-targeted, and that's what's driving up the cost of a lot of campaigns, but it's also stressing the critical nature of campaigns spending more upfront on getting good demographic data and focus group work than early spending on television. Television reaches older voters. It does not reach the millennials or the Generation Z very much. And the millennials and Gen Zers are 1/3 of our registered voters. And again, I pointed out the three youngest ones are more now, larger share than the boomers and the older generations. But let's just talk about that diversity issue, because our population is becoming much more racially and ethnically diverse. And it's easy to say, well, it's just among the Gen Z and millennials. It is greater there, but it's also true across all generations. And this is another aspect of Florida that makes it a little bit different than other places, but it's explained by the fact that so much of our people moving in here of all ages you have a more diverse group of people moving here than ever. But I think this is really the main point, and the reason I spent so much time early on talking about the racial and ethnic makeup of Florida, which is the top bar there. Across the state, you see 61% white, 17% Hispanic, 13% Black, 2% Asian, and then 6% other. But look at Generation Z is already a majority non-white. Very telling of another national demographic pattern and very relevant to Florida. If you go to the far end, the blue, which is 11%, much higher than statewide, that's other. And what that represents is people who describe themselves as bi or multiracial. And you absolutely see changing marriage patterns, changing interracial activities and relationships are much heavier and higher among these younger generations. So this is in and of itself, I can't just look at generation by itself. I can't just look at race by itself. If I'm running a campaign, I've got to look at the strong interface between these two kinds of demographics, or I can very easily lose a statewide race. But as I mentioned, the younger generations are even harder to reach because they're turning their back on the traditional two major parties. The green bar there reflects those who are registering as no party affiliation. So what you have is the older generations will almost always vote the party line. They're strong activists. It's the younger generations who are more malleable and a little bit harder to reach because you've got to convince them first to go vote and secondly to vote for your candidate. Well, herein lies the problem. Because they don't particularly like either party, they are increasingly swayed by individual characteristics of candidates. They're more candidate and issue centric than older voters. And this is interesting just to take a look, and I don't have the numbers here, but let me suffice you to say that Gillum got within 0.5% of beating DeSantis in 2018. And that was a recount election. You didn't see anywhere close to that in the Biden-Trump race. I still have my finger in a lot of young people's groups, being, connection with USF and an informal way, but in speaking to some of my students who are Democratic activists, they said, we just couldn't get anybody interested in voting for two old white guys. And if you contrast that with Gillum, he was very inspirational, which is a must to reach younger people. An inspirational candidate, number one. Number two, he spoke directly to their issues and he went directly to them. Now, granted, Democrats were somewhat burdened in 2020 by not being able to go door to door by edict of the National Democratic Party, not wanting to step on Biden's message of social distancing and so forth. But they want also, and this is important, I would say that those are the most important things, in the inspirational issues, genuine interest and knowledge of their issues. But thirdly, equally powerful, they want to see diversity in candidacies. You saw yesterday record numbers of minorities winning all across the country. And I'm going to get to that in a minute to show you some of the reasons why. So this is the challenge, is both parties being at parity and plummeting really in their share. Look at this growing group of voters who are no party affiliation, and they think, man, I got to figure out a way to reach them because I've got to have a pretty good chunk of them in a close race to be able to pull my candidate across the finish line. I think this is puts the pressure on generational outreach to the absolute zenith in 22 in Florida. And it is true, as I said, that over half of our NPAs are younger than 50. Here's another part of the NPA story, and that is that amongst Hispanics and Asians, consistently a larger share register as no party affiliation. And there's a tendency for candidates to ignore people who are registered as NPAs, but particularly in the general election, at your own peril. But it's also important to understand that culture adds a lot into the explanation. They don't have, if they've come, for example, even Puerto Ricans, their party system is nowhere near ours. It's very statehood or not statehood. It's not Democrat or Republican. So this is another element, but broadly, you see that Florida's white population plurality is Republican registrants. Hispanics, pretty even between Democrats and NPAs. The most solidly Democratic bloc are Blacks, but they're also very worried about the growing number of NPA Blacks because they've been counting on, and that's a lot of younger Blacks, of course, as we know. And the same thing, Asians, the plurality are more NPAs. So these are other pieces to a jigsaw puzzle that's called Florida that makes campaigning very, very difficult and complex. This is another look at it. This was a look comparison in last year's election at registration patterns, and the gray areas would show you those represent counties where the greatest increase in the number of registered voters was NPAs. And you see definitely the I-4 corridor from Pinellas and Hillsborough all the way over to Orange and Volusia. And then you get the Palm Beach areas, southeast areas, Lee being the anomaly there. These are areas where younger people are moving to. Businesses are moving in here. And these are the growth areas. And it's not surprising that you see this kind of pattern. A really big and important part of understanding Florida politics is the gender issue, which is now changing dramatically. For years, women have outnumbered men among our registrants, but this is data from the Florida Division of Elections. When you register, you don't have to put your gender. Most people do, but you'll notice at the bottom a very significant figure, and that is 3% refuse to list themselves as either. This reflects the bubbling up movement, and I'm going to show you some stats that shows you how far it's already into the younger generation of people who do not see gender as a binary concept. They see it as very different. Some states are already letting people register with a multiplicity of genders, but Florida isn't there yet. But that's why you see that. And again, it's part of the younger generation that must be understood. To me, this is one of the most significant charts that I'm going to show you about generations. And that is the registration gap between men and women. It's only, 5% among the whites, women more than men. Look at the differences between women, which is the green, and men, the blue, within these minority communities or communities of color. This is an incredibly telling story, which explains a lot about the rising power of women of color in politics, not only in activism, but also in candidacies. Much of this is explained by the fact that it's women who are going to college and not men, and it's particularly the gap is widest in terms of going to college among the Black population. One of the people at Leadership Florida yesterday asked me, an African-American member asked me about that. And I was pointing out that this is why so many groups are now forming to figure out ways to help Black men who tend to drop out of college and get into drugs and a lot of other problems that are much higher, become incarcerated at higher rates. But this is clearly, and this data is a couple of years old. If I had more current data, I think it would be an even sharper difference between men and women undergrads. The same pattern is true now in law school and med school and other professional schools in our state. But going back to the candidacies, I don't think a lot of people realized it unless you sat down and counted like we did. Like one of my former students is now getting her PhD at Rutgers in women in politics. But it was stunning to look at the number of women who ran for either Congress or the state Senate or the state House in 2020. that almost half were women of color coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. We're already seeing this pattern accelerating, and it's still nowhere near the filing dates, but we've seen it in some of the local contests that we saw just the other day. It's also important, this goes to the growth and where people are moving. The densely populated parts of our state are the orangish colors. The green are more rural, but you see a very coastal pattern to high density, like extending all the way up to Duval. And this data was from 2020, but now Flagler is one of the fastest growing counties in the state, and that's starting to change too. But younger people, and this is very important, tend still to migrate to the big urban areas. And that's why you saw a result yesterday in St. Petersburg election, where for the first time ever, they now have a Black mayor. They have a couple new Black council members, first Latino, younger people, changing demographic of the city. And you're seeing a little bit more out migration of people from these big urban areas infilling into the less congested parts of the state. And that's really starting to affect our politics. This really tells the story. This was a very good study that was just released in June, showing the growth in Florida where it is, and it's really growing more outside these major metros. And I just picked as an example, now this is just cities, this would be incorporated areas, but these are a study that was done earlier this year when the pandemic was still heavily underway, where people were moving to in Florida. And you'll notice that there are not a lot of huge cities on this list. And more recently, there was a study on across the country of where people are moving to. This is often a way we get the best data on demographics, by the way. Florida had 6 of the top 20 cities that people are moving to. So yes, growth has slowed down a little bit, but hey, not anything near what's happening to other places, and we're still a high growth state. So moving a little bit to the issues that are interesting. This is a national data, it's not Florida specific, but where you see the greatest differences in terms of younger people's versus older people's interest in issues, it's still, in my judgment, this today and in our state, racial inequality and climate change. Even though we're starting to see there's a little bit less of a difference in climate change. Climate change is getting to be a little bit more across the board, but it is clearly always one of the top 2 or 3 issues for younger people. What was also very interesting, and you saw it in Florida, is the tax issue. You really see the youngest and sort of the Gen Xers are the ones that were cited taxes as a reason that they, one of their most important issues. And those are really the ones that are stressed, the Gen Xers with putting their kids through college, and the younger ones with fear in college and unemployment and so forth, even though that's changed a bit. I did look at an earlier survey that was done a couple of weeks ago, national survey, which shows, and I agree with this too, affordable housing and water are seeping up as very big issues in Florida for 2022, along with these other things. But people move to Florida for the environment, and they don't want it spoiled. And I think you see a lot more interest in that. But the affordable housing is really significant for younger voters, and also particularly people who are not college educated. And it's now facing a lot of local jurisdictions. Their workforce, they can't afford to even rent. The escalation of rent, and of course that's what makes affordable housing, is starting to really affect the economies of certain places in our state. And I think that's going to be a big issue in some of the congressional and state legislative races. To me, this is the most troubling slide I'm going to show you. This poll was just done a couple weeks ago. National poll. It's looking at trust in institutions in this country. I just want you, and I'll give you a minute, it's kind of hard to see a bit. The far left bar, the sort of turquoise, is Generation Z. It doesn't matter what institution you're talking about. This young generation has the least trust of any generation. This has significance for the future of our country. It also explains the difficulty in reaching them politically and getting them engaged. Other than let me say, they're very issue engaged, but issue activism doesn't always translate into political activism. And that's a point I think a lot of people miss. It is true also, and I think this is extremely important, pointing to the need to target by generations. If you look at the views towards the bottom row here, far left, US government and US Congress, Silicon Valley, corporate America, Wall Street, whatever, millennials have considerably more trust than that next generation just a few years younger than they. I can't reach millennials and Gen Zers in the same way. And if I try to do it, it's not going to work effectively. Now, you can't win without turnout. We, of course, have had record turnout both in our midterm in 2018 and in our general election last year. But here are some things that reflect some of the generational composition and the fact that you didn't have a candidate for president that was engaging for some of the younger constituents. But you saw here the fact that Republicans turned out at a higher rate than Democrats isn't all that unusual. What is unusual is the differential and the NPAs. Of course, both Democrats and NPAs, a larger share, are the younger electorate. But this was also a bit troubling in that, you know, GOP turnout was higher among every generation, including the young, than the Democrats. This is another trend that people are starting to pick up on. There's danger in running campaigns that are only perceived as Black versus white. It is a white versus Black versus Hispanic versus Asian. It's a multiracial electorate, and the turnout rates is very interesting. Everyone that's looked at this data is kind of staggered by it, that Asian and Hispanic turnout rates were higher among the younger generations than Blacks. And of course, for the older generations, it's the Black. But it's not all that surprising because we've already seen the makeup of the younger generations. You had higher percentages of Asians and Hispanics than is true among the older. But here's the stunning part as well. Look at the turnout rates for men versus women. The gaps are widest among the two youngest generations. So you see Generation Z, there's 8% more women voted than men, 6% millennials, 3% Gen X, but then you get sort of negatives as you go down the line. This is reflective of the other pattern we've talked about now we have to look at generation interfacing with race and ethnicity, interfacing with gender, messages that can reach somebody that's three different things in all of those categories. So finally, the media picture is changing rapidly too. Old ways don't work. This is a very good study. If you are online, emarketer.com is a great source of constantly changing patterns in media use, and so is the Pew Research Center. But fewer people now watch traditional or get their news from TV, radio, print. Everybody's turning more digital. It's also true, I don't need to tell you this, that 18 to 24-year-olds, 71% get their news often from a smartphone, computer, tablet, television, print, forget it. In contrast, look to the 65 and over, you see an extremely different pattern where television is king. Here again, it's the means of communicating that you also have to pay attention to, and also the message. You realize right now that trust in the media is the lowest in the US of any country. And by the way, there's no generational difference in trust. The distrust is very deep across all generations. The only thing that kind of makes a difference is party. Democrats are more trusting than Republicans. If Republicans were in office, it would be the reverse. There's some of that going on, but in general, this is another troubling stat that almost 73% of Americans think that, well, they're worried about fake news and misinformation. And the difficulty of reaching there is people think what they use themselves is legit, but everything else is false. And there's no thread that really connects that across all generations. So when we look at the 22 elections coming up, I think you've seen the generational overlay on all of these things that were acknowledged as important lessons from 2020. The need to do this constant demographic updates at the micro level, micro targeting. You have to know who's living there because that can change. You can't use these broad pie charts that pollsters tend to use that don't tell you any differential among and between these categories that are vital and very different. Polling in Florida traditionally has been pretty bad. It's not getting any better in my judgment yet. And of course, we do know that in-person contact is very important. We also know that money isn't any guarantee of victory. It's how you spend it that's more important. So you got to know who's using what as communicating with people. And now you've got another overlay. This was just released a couple of weeks ago. Every time you have new technology coming along, younger people rush to it. So you might have thought you had them figured out, and suddenly something new comes along. They're going to be the first to buy it, the first to use it, the first to figure it out. And you see here, for example, streaming services, which have just caught on like wildfire. You know, baby boomers, only 40% have a clue about it, and almost 3/4 of the Gen Zers. It happens fast. You got to keep up with it. And I've already talked about the fact that you can't even assume that the millennials and the Gen Zers use the same social networks, because they do not. I find this one of the most interesting things that I've read recently. Effective reaching of voters under age 30 or 40 increasingly has to be visual. There are visual generations, video content, live streaming. I go to the, using social media, the feedback, even candidates have figured out letting people feedback is helpful, and user-generated content is going to be really it. I don't know if you saw the news, some guy that spent very little on a campaign that beat somebody big in New Jersey yesterday made his ad with a cell phone. His nephew cut it. Real people, not really flashy stuff, genuineness. The whole world of advertising is going to be turned upside down in next year's election. And if it's not, you're going to have the same problem with turnout among the younger demographic that we saw in the last election. Another thing is simply, you can't overload people with too many things. People basically, think about yourself. If you're in a store and you look at a couple products and you say, well, which one should I buy? Well, I really want this. I turn over in the back and I see, well, how much sugar has it got in it? And that's my decider. It's not every other thing that they have on the label. The same thing we saw in 2020. These are the ways that Florida voters, I analyzed it at content analysis. These are the different themes that you could see reaching different voters in our state. For example, and here's how it would go. If I was a voter that I was done with the chaos, I wanted calm, I would have voted Biden. And I'm talking about people that don't read everything, casual voters who do vote in a presidential. Or if my company had been locked down, but suddenly we're open, there's no way I want to go to a candidate that's talking about any kind of lockdown, so I'm going to vote for Trump. And you go down like the democracy versus socialism, Latino vote, the younger vote, divisiveness versus unity, the working class, lawlessness versus safety and security, and racial issues, all those things. Simple is better. And that is another factor that is being driven by generations. The dichotomies are going to have to be different because the issues are different. So I will end and take a few questions. Here's my observation. If you're an activist, or you're a candidate, or you're trying to understand things about Florida, it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle, but the bottom line is, I hope I've given you some insight into today. If you're not paying attention to these nuances that are generationally based in a state that's becoming more diverse by the day, age-wise and racial and ethnic-wise, you're going to lose Florida. So thank you very much. And I will take a few questions. Thank you.
I have a question.
Okay.
In discussing which method reaches which group of people, nowhere on it is there anything about the mail that we receive. I am just inundated with things in the mail. The other way is
Let me talk to that one first, okay?
Okay, phone calls is the other one.
Both of those are a total waste of money.
That's what I thought.
And when you ask candidates why they do it, they'll say because it's cheap. But wouldn't you think it would be better to put some money into some good focus group and demographic group ahead and come up with decent message? And the only reason, I can't see your age, but I presume that you're not under 40. The only people that read mail anymore are older voters, but even they're getting savvy and they just throw it in the trash. There's an old saying, a political consultant told me that, he was in honesty, came to talk to my class a few years ago. He said, he's a direct mail person. He said, if I have only until a person gets the thing out of the mailbox to the first trash can to make them even look at anything about mine. It's not working. It may work more in, depending on the demographic of the electorate. If it's an older place, the villages, perhaps it works better, but in an urban area where you're trying to reach younger people, it's not going to work very effectively. Good question, though. Thank you.
Larry, go ahead.
Would I be right in saying that, or observing that the Republicans are much better at framing their messages than the Democrats?
Yes, you're correct. And one of the problems that Democrats have is their diversity. There's strength in their diversity, but the diversity is really complicated in terms of messaging. Absolutely. And they want to give everything but the kitchen sink. One other thing, which you reminded me of that I forgot to mention in this survey that I just looked at, that was a couple days old, we are seeing, and this is interesting in light of the gender, we are seeing, and it was broken down by generation, that the youngest generation is very interested in women's issues. That's the first time we've seen that in a long while, which I think is interesting. But you're right, it's harder to reach because you've got the caucuses. If you look at how the Florida Democratic Party is structured, you've got the caucuses, each of them wants to have their message. And actually it would do better that they start realizing you can message differently, but the one size fits all, you alienate a certain piece of the puzzle and they just don't turn out. But that's a very good observation.
Mm-hmm. And having been in the business, I would say that the Republicans are better also at choosing advisors to help them with the messaging.
Absolutely. And part of the reason is, and Democrats themselves, anything I say about this has come straight from that, from interviewing people, and also come from that post-election analysis. But what they complain about, if local and like congressional candidates, Democrats running for office last time, who ended up losing when polls showed them ahead when they were going to the election, internal polls. The DNC or national groups often force consultants and pollsters onto Florida candidates if they want to get money. People who have no clue about the nuances that we've just spent 45 minutes detailing, and anyone could do that. It may take a while, but yes, it is true that the messaging and so forth, they're better at that.
And it shows in the results.
Yes, it does. And they're very angry. I don't blame them. Yesterday, you saw the same thing. There was a Democratic candidate, I believe, in New Jersey, where there were some big upsets there too, who was again complaining, look, I lost. You had me ahead. Internal polling had me ahead by double digits and I lost. So you campaign differently. I really urge people, focus groups and neighborhood groups and talking to people is much better than some of these polls that are based on 200 or 300 people that are about as useless as I don't know what. But
And they lie.
yeah,
And
but
we have
they're
a
done for
question in-
business. They're a business.
We have a question in chat. How will the primaries work with NPA and selection of candidates?
It's going to be very interesting because when you look at the NPAs, of course, the most interesting primary that we have so far is going to be in the gubernatorial contest between Charlie Crist, Nikki Fried, and Annette Taddeo. And there are some who are already looking. Remember the 3 things I told you to look at. But the problem is the younger people aren't going to be able to, NPAs aren't going to be able to weigh in on the primary. Remember when Floridians turned down that top 2 primary, which I never understood why people who wanted to change our primary system went to that, which is California. Most people don't want to repeat much of what's going on in California and Florida, seriously. But the more common thing that I think could possibly pass in Florida is a more common type of open primary. And I think both parties are looking at that growing NPA pool and wanting them to have some of it, is this the kind of open primary in a lot of places. I taught in Texas for years. This is what they had. And they're not the only, a lot of our states have it. If I'm an NPA, I can pick which party's primary I want to vote in. Then no one's disenfranchised from the primary. But the top 2, as Gwen Graham accurately pointed out, would have yielded in the 2018 governor's race if it had been in place. The top 2 candidates on the ballot would have been DeSantis versus Adam Putnam. So that I understood why both parties were against the top 2 thing.
I know we're almost there on time. Lynn, do you have any final questions or comments?
Yeah, real quick question if you have time for it. What about the Supreme Court cases, that the hot button ones on reproductive rights and guns? Do you think that's going to affect, and how do you think that's going to affect next year's turnout? And
I think that's exactly why they want to get this over with right now. The court, they're putting them on expedited calendar, especially the abortion, because there's conflicting laws out there, which, as you know, generates Supreme Court interest in a case. Well, from looking at those stats and looking at the fact that you see the growing differential and role of women in politics, and particularly young women of color, I think that the abortion issue might have some impact, but I do think that less so than people really ultimately think. It's kind of something that's baked into people already. But if it eliminates pro-choice, eliminates abortion, I do think you'll have backlash that would help candidates that are pro-choice. Just how much? Because my point still is we don't know what's going to be the big driver next year. Normally, if I had a little bit more time, I analyzed 2020, there were 13 different news saturation issues, meaning from January till November of last year, the issue that was dominate, news saturation means it dominates the news and nothing else can breathe in 2 or 3 weeks time. We had 13 of those. We've already had 8 in the last 3 months here in Florida, including the Virginia thing yesterday. Who knows where the dial's going to stop? But I will say generically, people will vote. If times are bad, they're going to vote out whoever's in office. Right now, to me, the biggest issues are G&G, gas and groceries, simple. Something that's broad reaching, a concept everybody gets. But is that going to be what's driving by the time people vote in October, if they vote early next year? Who knows? And that's what makes campaigning so difficult. But right now, these parties need to be focusing on registration. A lot of people have moved in. Democrats are lagging behind that. And Republicans, of course, never stopped during the pandemic, and Democrats did. So now they're having to play catch up. I'm going to be watching particularly the January and February new registration stats when they come out to see if Democrats have they've hired a lot of people to make this happen, but we'll see.
Mhm. Any other questions?
I think we did it. Dr.
Okay.
MacManus, we made
Well,
your
thank
time.
you so much for taking the time, and we really appreciate it. And as always, it was a very good talk. So
Well,
thank you.
thank you. I appreciate all of you for what you're interested in, and it's just a good thing that people never give up the will to learn. So thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.